Hello and welcome to Art Laughs with me, Verity Babs. Today I'm speaking to Jo Wells. I'm here today with Jo. Jo, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I am Jo Wells. I'm a comedian and a writer.
You have chosen technically now a print, but a drawing for us. Could you introduce that?
Yes, it's a drawing of London by Stephen Wiltshire, who I find incredibly fascinating person. I think he's an incredible artist. He is an autistic man. When he was at school, he had his IQ measured as having an IQ of 60, so that'd be someone with a learning disability. Um, he makes incredible art. There's an amazing documentary which I first saw him in, which is from the 80s, and it's dated so much, but it's called something really offensive, like the foolish wise ones, I think, or something like that. And it's all these people who have different kind of neurodivergences, and in the language of the documentary are handicapped, but have these incredible skills. And it's I think it's interesting to watch. I'm currently writing a book about neurodiversity, and I think it's quite interesting looking back and see how how much we've come in that time, and watching that documentary, see people fascinated, kind of going, well, how come he's not good at these things, but he's really good at drawings? How can this be? So yeah, I think he's an incredible artist and a fascinating person.
And this drawing is just spectacularly detailed. So we're kind of flying over the South Bank, towards the
It'll be
South
drawn
Bank.
from memory. Wow.
As you started talking, I was like, I have heard of this artist, because when you sent it through, I was like, oh, that'll be interesting, because I don't know anything about this artist, and it's like quite a modern piece, and that'd be interesting to see whether you had a personal connection to it, and that's why you chose it. And then as you started speaking, and I was like, I do remember there being a shot of an artist flying over London in a helicopter.
Mm.
Does this piece in particular stand out to you out of Stephen's work, or is this just quite a good example of his stuff?
I think this one particular, I love London. So I'm from the kind of suburbs of Portsmouth, and then when I was a teenager, I went to London a few times, and it was just like this. So I get the train line in that went through like Clapham Junction, and when you kind of come out of Clapham Junction, out of that tunnel, it just has this it's like you're kind of entering the belly of this incredible thing. And and I think that's why so I love London, and I think that his stuff, particularly stuff about all cities, but I think there's an interview where he said that he likes cities that have order and chaos, and I think that's very true of London, where everything is there for a reason, but it's also this kind of chaotic thing. I just think it really sums up the city. Yeah, I as someone who grew up in the suburbs, I was very excited to go to the big city.
London has that interesting thing that not very many capital cities have, which is, a lot of capital cities underwent lots of civil planning where, like in Paris, where they'll knock down loads of stuff in order to build boulevards that are kind of very structured. Whereas London has just had to build around the old things that are still there. And so you get these shiny new offices kind of wrapped around, a 17th century church that's fallen to bits, but they've kept it there, and the streets are very narrow. So it really does have that order and disorder.
There's a river running through the middle of it. And then in this drawing, you see the river going through, and that just feels like there's something slightly kind of chaotic about that. That river hasn't been planned being there. It's taken up so much real estate, having a river going through London, and I really love that.
Yeah, who planned this? Who gave this the go-ahead? You mentioned writing your book, and would you say that you kind of have approached Stephen's work from that interest, or is art something that you're kind of also separately interested in?
So the book should be coming out next year. It's a young adult book about important neurodivergent people. So that's the angle that I'm kind of coming at from coming at Stephen's work from, I guess. yeah, I'm interested in art and go to galleries and stuff like that, but I wouldn't say I was a kind of proper art nerd. But yeah, so the neurodiversity perspective is what I'm interested in with Stephen's work. You know, the way in which he has this very specific skill. And I think if you kind of look over his career and the stuff that's written about him, there's a film which came out recently called A Billion Windows. The narrative around him changes, and the older stuff, there's lots of in his old books, where he was 3 books published by the time he was 16. And in those old books, all the forewords and stuff are saying, how can this person have done this? And it's like, it's almost this kind of like kind of this mystery of how can someone who has a disability produce this incredible work. And I think the narrative around that has changed, where the work is just so strong that he kind of stands on his own as an artist now, and there's no one's talking about the fact that, you know, he has difficulties with verbal communication, because that's just become irrelevant next to this work. And I think that's what I find really interesting.
And that's a kind of discourse that is around lots of things, you know, about, you know, why do we have to have, you know, the best male actor in a movie rather than just being the best actor in a movie, or these kind of elements that we would now view as potentially more background used to be, and even 20, 30 years ago, used to be viewed as like the core fact of the matter.
And I think the fact that he's autistic is wholly relevant to his work, but I think that the older narrative of going, you know, that documentary being called The Foolish Wise Ones, there was times like Idiot Savant that used to be used for people like Stephen, you know, I think have dated a lot. The thing I've kind of learned most writing this book is I really realized how pervasive the idea is of like I guess almost of like IQ, of, you know, you've got people at one end who are really, really clever and they're good at everything, and then you've got people at the other end who they're not good at anything, and actually people's skill sets are much more spiky. And Stephen's someone who has quite a noticeably spiky skill set, where he's got this very specific, you know, skill around memory and drawing and those kind of things, which make this work. But actually, you know, lots of people have spiky skill sets, and the way we talk about you know, what our brains can do is, you know, it still has evolved a lot and is still evolving.
I thought it'd be interesting to talk about, you mentioned about growing up outside of Portsmouth, and I grew up in the countryside in the Midlands, and there's an interesting thing, I think, about not growing up in a capital city, or not growing up in, you know, in one of the, you know, second or third largest cities in the country, that does change your relationship, I think, and your access to art and, you know, cultural things. In that, you know, if I wanted to go and, you know, and see art for a day, or like have a day where I went to a couple of galleries, you'd have to go on a day trip to London. And you have this idea that, you know, all the gigs are in London or they're in Birmingham, and having to travel out from outside of those cities inwards to get that kind of cultural nourishment, I suppose. And I'm not sure what the kind of cultural scene is like in Portsmouth, but I think that around the UK, and probably in most countries, it's the case that the outskirts of cities and you know, the countryside have less access to these kinds of things. So did you find that you were able to access a lot of music and art growing up in Portsmouth, or was it that case that you did have to kind of journey to it?
Well, I didn't even grow up in Portsmouth. I grew up outside of Portsmouth, so for me, it was like an hour bus journey into Portsmouth. I do think that there's there becomes a kind of deficit of kind of cultural aspiration, if that's not a very pretentious way of talking about it, but like, you know, I think I didn't. So an interesting. Here's an example. One of the people I've been interviewing for the book with is a DJ called Farah Nanji, and she talks about going to clubs growing up, and she's talking about going to these clubs in London where she was going to Fabric and places like that, where they're kind of pioneers of this sound. And for me, going to clubs was, you know, there's like a few clubs in Portsmouth that, you know, play pop music on a Friday night. So my experience of what club music could be and what it is were quite limited to just what I was presented with, and I don't think I would have become, I'm not saying I would have become growing up in London, but I think that, having kind of cultural things on your doorstep certainly helps to open your eyes to things, and it certainly is a privilege.
I found that at university as well, is that I was one of the few people who weren't from London, or certainly not from a city, and talking about things where, we'd have lectures about, so has anyone seen this? And it'd be, in the National Portrait Museum or in the National Gallery. And of course, everyone who was from London had seen it because, they lived there and they've had the, 18 years of their life the chances are they probably have been there because it's local. And that's something that I think people miss out on. And it's the same, I suppose, for kind of creative jobs as well. I don't know whether you felt this pressure as a comedian, that things happen in London and things happen in cities. And if you want to be a successful comedian, you probably should move to London to gig, or you probably should move to Manchester to gig, and you have to have these large bases. And have you felt that pressure? I'm not, where are you based now?
I'm still in Portsmouth, yes. I'm resisting the pressure.
Yeah. But would you say that the pressure has been there?
Yeah, I think there's there's an assumption of. I have kind of conversation with people in London where I think that a lot of it is less of like a pressure. It's more of like a kind of people who have grown up in London, live in London, they see that as the world a bit, and I think that's part of the problem more than I don't necessarily feel the pressure to pay $1,000 a month for a tiny bed sit, but hour and a half on the train. It does feel like London is a kind of cultural hub. I wonder whether coronavirus will change that. I wonder whether people will start to do things differently, think differently about things.
Yeah, I mean, today the BBC announced that they're moving some kind of key programmes up north to have kind of bases there, and that will be interesting to see how. And coronavirus making so much digital. I moved to London to do a job in London last February, and I worked in the office for a month and a half, and then we were locked down, and now my job is entirely remote. And it is that thing of, do I want to be spending £700 to live in London when I could do my job from anywhere?
Friends of mine, where I talk about, and I think it's different for people growing up in London. There's the issue of people being driven out of London by high rents. But when I kind of creative friends of mine who've moved into London, and they'll talk about the rents in London, I never quite understand why people stay there when they could move out of London. They might not have to work a part-time job to pay their rent, and they can spend a lot more time creatively. And the money they save, they can get train into London. But yeah, it does seem like maybe it's one of those things like owning a car. Once you're in London, you're in, and you can't imagine being out of it.
And that's the thing of my friends were absolutely shocked to the core when I mentioned that I might move to Southampton with my partner. And they were like, moving to Southampton, but you won't be in London. It's like, it is only an hour and 20 minutes on a train to get into London. But they acted as if I was saying that I was moving to Munich.
Yeah, and you
or the moon.
And I think when you're like working in a kind of creative industry, that time and time is worth so much. If you got some spare time, that's what you're after, and that's what's going to get you ahead. So I think if you can save a load of money on rent, and you can and it's depressing to say, but also having some spare money, that's why a lot of the creative industries are dominated by people from a certain classes, because if you've got money to throw around, you don't have to work a day job when you're stuck. Also, you can pump money into, particularly with kind of a lot of self-produced stuff, you can pump money into projects which into your own personal projects, and if you're saving money on rent, that helps a lot. I've realised I put forward a drawing and was going to talk about how I love London, and I've just slagged it off for most of this podcast.
Do you know what? I think that you can love London and also accept that it needs a bit of slagging off.
I love and hate London, but it's. I think also I love this is what that painting sums up is that entering London just feels like almost like a kind of like it always feels like something from a film. You know, when I get off that train, or even just seeing the train go in and all the buildings kind of rise up. It's just the most exciting thing, and you know, and I know I'm going to a gig. I love walking across it's a Waterloo Bridge. So I do Top Secret comedy in Soho a lot, and I'll walk across. It'll be daylight, and I'll walk there, and on the way back it'll be nighttime, and I'll walk across that bridge, and you see all the lights, and it just feels. Every time I walk across that bridge, I have a kind of moment of like, you know, I've done all right. Like this is my job, and I get to have this walk home. I've done a job that I enjoy.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for talking to me today. You spoke about your book, but where else can we follow you? And do you have anything else to plug?
So you can follow me on Twitter, which is Joe Wells Comic, and Instagram is Joe Wells Comedian, because I set up Joe Wells Comic and then I lost the password. And the book should be coming out next year through Jessica Kingsley Publishers. It's provisionally called Differently Wired. So yeah, should be out next year.
Cheers for watching. You can follow Joe in the ways written below, and as per usual, you can follow me at VerityBabsArt. It'd be great if you could give us a subscribe and a like and a share, and I'll see you next time.